So when you sit down and you start to make a game, and you want that game to be an ARPG and a CRPG and a JRPG all at once, that plan can only go one of two ways. It can either be a masterpiece or a total disaster. Well, today we are going to be talking about a game that does just that and swings wildly between these two extremes. That game is Dark Envoy, and shout out to the folks at Event Horizon for sending me a review code for me to tell you all about it. Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumbing for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And today we have Dark Envoy, a game developed and published by Event Horizon, the chaps who also gave us Tower of Time back in the year 2018. Like its predecessor, Dark Envoy blends gameplay elements that we typically find in a CRPG with ARPG mechanics, and it throws in a few thingies that we tend to see mostly in JRPGs. The best part about this sampler platter of RPG subgenres is Event Horizon's unique homemade sauce of real-time with pause or slow combat that we are definitely going to be talking about today. If you don't know Event Horizon, know then that these are guys who stick to their guns. They remind me a bit of id Software during the early days of John Romero, and From Software since the very early days of Demon's Souls. Both of these giants of video game development thrived on having a formula. A very cleverly defined formula that they tweaked and perfected or repeated endlessly over the course of the years. And like these two old chaps that we're all too familiar with, Event Horizon also has its own trademark formula. Some of its components are truly amazing, and others are in dire need of replacement in my opinion. So if you have played Tower of Time, then I have a quick version of this review for you.
It's the same!
Expect only a few minor tweaks to the gameplay and narrative formulas featured in Tower of Time, a few of which were for the better, but also many that were for the worse. If you haven't played Tower of Time, then stay a while and listen because this review will be covering a bit of both titles. As you know, I review games according to a system of categories that I think are relevant to the genre of the game at hand. Dark Envoy doesn't squarely fit the mold of the ARPG, the CRPG, or the JRPG subgenres. It sits somewhere in between. So because it is perhaps the most comprehensive, we are going to be using our CRPG category system. And as you very well know, when it comes to those, character creation and character progression are up first, as means to build your characters so that they serve the role you wish each of them to have in combat. The game's character creation and progression system is pretty freaking impressive, for a time at least. Combat is the turnstone in Dark Envoy, and the game's character progression system provides players with an ample variety of tools that allows them to hone each character to the role they are supposed to have in the party for combat purposes. This arsenal of tools is flexible enough for players to build their party around their own strategic vision, and just by looking at the skills available for each class, you'll get a pretty good idea of how they can be combined in interesting synergies with tactical consistency. But more importantly, they are extremely fun to use. You control two characters in Dark Envoy, siblings Malachi and Kayla. At the beginning of the game, you can customize their appearance, allocate 3 points to any of the 5 attributes available, and choose a class for each of them. The good news is that in Dark Envoy, the jack-of-all-trades approach is every bit as viable as the min-maxer build that you would usually go for in these types of games. The bad news is that it won't make a lick of a difference by the end of the game, because the level cap in Dark Envoy is 20, you get 3 attribute points every time you level, and the maximum level per attribute is 25. And this means that you are going to have enough attribute points to make the difference between a jack-of-all-trades and a fully committed min-maxer nothing more than an anecdote. Classes in Dark Envoy aren't going to win any originality awards. You have your typical warrior, ranger, engineer, and adept, but each of these classes have been clearly designed to serve a combat role within a party. This game expects you to understand the concepts of tanking, healing, DPS, and crowd control. And as the tactical mastermind behind the wheel of your party, you are expected to have a very good idea of what you want from each of your characters and choose their skills accordingly. At the end of every mission, you get this little report that informs you, amongst other things, which party member dealt the most damage, who took the most damage, and who healed the most. And this information is valuable for you to assess how well your party members are performing their duties. I chose the Ranger class for Kayla, which is a class that has all sorts of damage dealing skills and focuses mostly on critical chance and critical damage. And of course, every time I leveled, I allocated the 3 points I got to those attributes that were directly related to her damage output. Also, all throughout the game, I kept an eye out for gear that focused mostly on weapon damage, critical hit chance, and critical damage. I turned her into a glass cannon, if you will. The result was that Kayla was at the top of the DPS charts in every single fight, without exception, and by a very large margin. Similarly, I turned Malachi into a warrior, and I was oh so freaking pleased to see that this game and I speak the same language when it comes to the role of the tank. In my book, a tank is supposed to be all about damage mitigation and funneling as much incoming damage onto itself as possible. Remember the days of, guys, we need to send the tank in first so that he can build some aggro.
I understood that reference.
Of course you do, you're all nerds. Well, that tactic is back in the menu, boys. If you don't share this notion, or if you think it's simplistic or too MMO-y for your taste,
and I got news for you. That means you're gay.
It means this game is definitely not for you. Combat can get quite complex and challenging at times in the insane difficulty level, I tell you. And the complexity comes from the combat encounter itself, battle scenarios, enemy talents and tactics, and the decisions you have to make to counteract said talents and tactics. As I was saying, the warrior class in Dark Envoy has just the right talents to play the role of a tank. You have a taunt skill, for example, a proper taunt skill with upgrades and everything. And this is very interesting because enemies in Dark Envoy have a threat level criteria embedded into their AI, which means that they will go after those party members who are doing the most damage. The bad guys are also quite opportunistic, and they often like to go after those party members who are about to die, or the most fragile ones, or the ones that are doing too much healing, depending on the situation. Tanks also have a ton of skills, both passive and active, that mitigate damage and negative effects of all types, and skills that make other party members more resilient. And that's all I want from my meat shields. I understand that the class system that I just described may sound awfully restrictive and crippling of your precious creativity, and to some extent it is. But over the course of the game, each character unlocks a primary and a secondary specialization. This is not multi-classing, mind you, each class has its own set of specializations, 3 per class to be specific. You unlock your first specialization when you hit level 7. The first specialization that you choose comes with a full set of skills. The second one can be unlocked when you hit level 14, but only some of its skills will be made available to you. Specializations can be used to make your character stronger at his primary function inside the party, but they can also be used to add a little pinch of this or that to make them a little bit more balanced and versatile, which I think is pretty good. The Guardian specialization for a tanky warrior, for example, is a no-brainer for those who want to make their tanks even tankier. But an engineer with a constructor specialization may act like a wild card capable of doing some healing, some off-tanking with the many constructs that he has at his disposal, a fair bit of crowd control with his incapacitating skills, and even a pinch of damage. He also has an arsenal of tactical talents that allow him to turn the tables of battle in his party's favor. Adepts can be offensive, defensive, or tactical wildcards as well, depending on their specialization. Rangers mostly specialize in damage, but they can be tailored to be really good for Slayer types of combat encounters, or geared to be more efficient at Survivor types of challenges. I found combat skills in Tower of Time to be a little bit more interesting and fun, but the ones in Dark Envoy are also pretty cool. What I like the most about combat skills in Dark Envoy is that many of them synergize well with other skills within the same base class, but also with specialization specific skills, and even with skills of other classes, which is pretty badass if you ask me. Take for example stun criticals. This ranger skill makes your criticals stun your enemies for 2 seconds. Then you have steady hand, which is a skill within the sharpshooter specialization that gives you an additional 15% critical chance while your character is taking cover. Then you have in cover, which grants you an additional 20% dodge. And all of these skills are passive. And engineers with a constructor specialization can use the construct cover skill to summon a mobile cover to the spot of their choosing that comes with healing over time bonuses. And this means that you can have sharpshooter rangers take cover anywhere in the combat field while taking advantage advantage of that additional 15% critical chance that comes from the steady hand skill, whilst also gaining some healing over time from the engineer's construct cover skill, as well as an increased dodge chance from their own passive in cover skill. And this is all pretty freaking
amazing,
if you ask me. Every time you level in Dark Envoy, you get 3 points that you can spend on 5 different attributes, and the benefits you get with each level of the attribute are clearly explained with a simple tooltip. Every 5 levels you get 1 major milestone bonus. So you're probably thinking, oh, so min-maxing for the win then. And yes, this is one way to do it, certainly, but unlike classic ARPGs, in which you generally dumped most of your attribute points into your class's most important stats, every class in Dark Envoy benefits quite significantly from at least 2 or 3 of the attributes. And depending on your game plan, you may want to reach some of those milestones in the different attributes. Like we said, a jack of all trades is a perfectly viable option, and this is because attributes are pretty well balanced and designed in this game. The downside though, like we said, is that this becomes pretty trivial near the last stretch of the game, because the level cap is too high and you earn too many attribute points. This flattens the cost aspect of the character creation equation, because by the end of the game, you'll get the feeling that you didn't have to sacrifice anything to build your characters the way you did. This is also true of your class and your specializations. When I say your level cap is too high, I'm not even close to kidding you, my friends. It's high. This is a picture of one of my level 20 characters. As you can see, I have 12 class points that I could never spend, simply because there weren't any more skills to spend these points in. I also unlocked 16 different skills with all their upgrades, 12 of which I didn't get to use because you can only have 4 skills at any given time. I suppose this last thing is not entirely bad, as you can experiment with some skills to see which ones you like the most, but it still means that you'll end up spending resources on skills that you aren't going to use. And to further pulverize opportunity cost into cosmic dust, you can respec at any given time. Gear is an important aspect of your character's progression in Dark Envoy, a very important aspect. This game leans a bit more towards the ARPG approach when it comes to character progression and gameplay. But unlike other titles in the genre, it's not an endless parade of loot. You collect a fairly big number of items as you explore the different areas of the world while bashing and trashing anything that stands in your way. But you never become a courier of trash gear who says, "I am overburdened" every other minute. It still gets a little bit tiresome, sameish, and pointless near the end of the game, but I still prefer this to the walking loot piñatas we get in almost every other ARPG. Gear in Dark Envoy is categorized in various ways. There are levels, qualities, and what I call factions, basically because the game doesn't call it anything. The way I see it, factions are more closely associated with classes. There's Marauder gear, Imperial gear, Elven gear, and Ancient gear. Imperial gear, for example, seems to be particularly useful for engineers, while Elven gear seems to be a little bit more geared towards magic types. But any class can wear gear from any faction. Gear has weight though, and the more weight a character has, the slower it'll move around the battlefield. And movement speed is very important in this game, so keep that in mind. Levels affect mostly the base stats of the piece, and quality refers to the item's rarity. The rarer the item, the more likely it is for it to have additional attributes and better stats. Items don't have any special talents or attributes that improve or synergize with class-specific skills. In games like Diablo 2, Grim Dawn, or Titan Quest, for example, some items had magical attributes like +1 to Resurrect, or +2 to all summoning skills, and this made their tactical value go through the roof. Items in Dark Envoy have your typical +X% of health regeneration, or +Y flat increment of such and such resistance. This is pretty standard for the genre, but I've been spoiled by Diablo 2, so I'm always a little bit disappointed when items only have these types of bonuses. I usually cover additional mechanics like crafting and enchanting when I talk about secondary mechanics and user experience, but these mechanics are crucial to your character's progression in Dark Envoy. In this game, you have a feature called Research. Research allows you to use collectible sheets of research papers to unlock additional perks in 3 different areas: crafting, enchanting, and tactical. Advancing the crafting branch allows you to craft better gear, of course. Crafting itself is pretty seamless, intuitive, and robust. You just need to choose the type of item you wish to craft, the level, and the rarity of the item. Each item has 3 basic random attributes. Clicking on the pre-craft button displays your items' would-be bonuses, and it gives you the chance to re-roll each bonus individually if you wish at the cost of a few soul cores. Crafting items also requires soul cores, and you come by these while exploring mandatory and non-mandatory dungeons. And the game does a pretty good job selling you its crafting system, because the first times you get to use it, you make gear that's better than anything you've collected up until that point. So although you get your best pieces of equipment from chests and enemy corpses, crafting is a good way to get better gear for those slots that weren't favored by the RNG gods of loot during the last few missions. And the reroll feature makes the crafting mechanic even more attractive, as it gives you the chance to further customize your item to make it more useful to the character who's going to wield it given his or her role in the party. Some of the items you find and craft in Dark Envoy have sockets, and there are different enchantments that you can embed into them. The deeper you get into the enchantment research branch, the more powerful the enchantments available for purchase and socketing. I particularly like the high tier enchantments because they give you insanely powerful bonuses at the cost of pretty hefty penalties, which adds further tactical value and opportunity cost to them. And then you have the tactical research branch, which isn't very tactical. It just flat out improves your fighting capabilities by giving you bonuses to stuff like damage and resilience, but it also grants you extra global skills that act like emergency buttons that you can arbitrarily use whenever you need them. One of them, for example, allows you to revive all fallen party members with 50% health. And this combination of classes, gear, research disciplines, and whatnot is all fine and dandy, and it amounts to a deliciously robust and insanely fun character progression system filled with cool synergies. But unfortunately, all of this is completely undone by the end of the game, because you earn too many attributes, skill, and specialization points every time you level. Similarly, there are too many mandatory and non-mandatory areas filled with soul cores, mining nodes, and research papers, and you use these resources to get gear and to advance your research paths, which means that by the end of the game, you are going to have the best of everything. And this kills opportunity cost because it makes you feel like you could have taken a very different approach to your character's build, and you still would have had the exact same results. And I don't want to end this section without putting out there that this game leans very much into its narrative aspect. Your characters are constantly talking to NPCs, there are companions who tag along for the ride who have their own background stories and even quests that you can help them with, and there are even decisions for you to make story-wise that have consequences further down the road. And these are things that you typically find in CRPGs. And the way I see it, in this subgenre, players expect to have an input on their character's social capabilities. Skills like persuasion, intimidation, deception, and even personality traits are almost mandatory for the genre. And this is decidedly absent in Dark Envoy. And substituting all of this with Boolean choices every now and then that you make in the name of people whose personalities you have zero control over isn't going to cut it, I think. I, for one, felt almost completely detached and only marginally interested in these decisions, and it's a pity because there was great potential there. Gameplay. If you have played Tower of Time, you only need to know that Dark Envoy sticks to that formula like glue, with very little variation. If you haven't played Tower of Time, well, know that there is combat, some puzzle solving, and questing to be done in Dark Envoy. The structure of the game is as follows. NPC asks you to do something, you leave the city and the location where you have to do said something appears on your map, along with 2 additional non-mandatory dungeons. You may choose to go to one of these 2 additional dungeons before you go to the mission critical location, or skip them altogether. Then you go to the mission critical location, watch the cutscene, kill everything, follow every marker on your map to collect everything there is to collect, watch the final cutscene of the dungeon, go back to the city, open the research tab, and use the crafting and enchanting tabs as you see fit. From then on out, it's rinse and repeat ad nauseum. Combat is the most important aspect of the gameplay mix in Dark Envoy, and when it shines, it's oh so motherfucking awesome. The problem is that it doesn't always shine, and we'll get into why later. Some people in the dark corners of the internet have labeled the combat in Dark Envoy the future of real-time with pause combat. And, well, yes, if we only take into account combat mechanics per se, and not other aspects that are also relevant to the combat experience like level layout, enemy spawn points, etc. One of my favorite things about it is that you can either slow down the action upon pressing the spacebar, like you could in Tower of Time, or you can pause the game entirely, in classic real-time with pause fashion if you wish. And you can even configure the speed at which combat goes when it's slowed down. And this is pretty cool because some fights are decidedly more fun if you slow down the combat instead of pausing it completely. Combat in Dark Envoy combines the fast-paced action of the click fest of the ARPG subgenre with the tactical depth of the real-time with pause mechanic that became a staple of CRPGs during the late 90s and early 2000s. But there are a few things that make Event Horizon's combat formula unique, and I believe I have identified a few of them. In Dark Envoy, some enemy attacks cannot be avoided by running or rolling away from them. These attacks can only be mitigated with stats such as armor or the corresponding resistance score, or with RNG-dependent mechanics like dodge. This works pretty much like it does, for example, in a D&D-based CRPG. However, there are attacks that you can avoid by moving out of the attack's trajectory or by stepping out of their AoE depending on the case, and this is very much an ARPG mechanic. But this doesn't require split-second timing from the player because every attack that can be avoided is adequately telegraphed. And if you pause or slow down the action, you can click outside the attack's trajectory or its AoE depending on the case, and upon resuming the action, your character will move out of the way automatically. And when I say that every attack that can be avoided is adequately telegraphed, I mean that every attack is telegraphed in two ways. You get a red line or cone or circle indicating the spread or the area of effect of the attack, and also a moving indicator telling how much time you have to move away. And you have to give props to whomever came up with this system because it is very complex, but this complexity is transparent to you as a user because it is super intuitive and super easy to use. And on the insane difficulty level, when the game is at its best, during some of the most challenging encounters, every time you pause the action, you'll see a series of telegraphed attacks and actions that will require you to counterplay them, much like you would in a chess match. Because many of your enemies use their skills and tactics in a way that forces you to think about how to use your party's own skills and their synergies to counter their moves. Some enemies use chains to pull you into swarms of minions, some can mind control your party members, some conjure up vortexes that pull your party members away from cover and into damage over time AoEs, some are cowardly bastards who stand behind enemy lines and summon minions that hit like trucks, some are snipers with insta-kill attacks. There's great enemy variety in this game. The enemy variety that we want to see, the one that counts. I like very much that when the action is paused or slowed down, you can input a skill that triggers instantly, followed by another action without having to unpause. And upon resuming the action, your party member will diligently perform one action after the other. I think this gives the user further control over the pace of the combat, and it's also very rewarding when these actions work like a combo. But these are all operational details about how combat works, but how do they make combat in Dark Envoy good? Well, this system prioritizes sound tactical decision making over gear, but it does so without trivializing builds, because enemies have a combination of attacks that can be avoided and attacks that can only be mitigated or prevented through RNG dependent mechanics. Builds only serve to make a good strategy more efficient. They are not your ticket to brute force your way to victory. And this is definitely a good thing. I read a rant by some noob online complaining about the difficulty of the final boss in the game and about how the ads named Eye of Chaos needed to be nerfed on the insane difficulty. And it was all because he wasn't capable of coming up with a tactic to counterplay their actions. To be fair, very few people are, apparently, aside from yours truly. But make no mistake about it, there are things to rant about in Dark Envoy, and many of them have to do with the game's bosses. So let's get to it. So, what's bad about the combat in Dark Envoy? Level design is not particularly interesting in this game, I fear. There are a few buildings and structures that you can use to take cover, and making the best use of those is a big part of your combat tactics in this game. But you don't have interesting architecture with multiple floors to climb, or topographical accidents with plateaus that you could use as vantage points, or natural rocky corridors for you to use as choke points. Mission locations in this game consist of flat areas with a few walls, statues, and pillars that you can use to take cover, but that's about it. Also, once you walk into a combat area and attack the first visible bad guy, the area gets locked down, Devil May Cry style, and you can't leave until the combat encounter is over. But it's rarely a what you see is what you get deal, because all these areas have enemy spawn points that will start summoning bad guys once you clear the initial group of enemies, and they won't stop until this meter you see here reaches 100%. And there are too many things that I don't like about this system. First, the fact that the area gets locked down when you trigger the combat encounter means that you can't go back the way you came, and this greatly limits your tactical possibilities. You can't, for example, lay a trap outside the combat area and lure your enemies to it. You can't use kiting tactics across the entire location, which is a favorite tactic of mine in many of these games. You can't position your party members in vantage points to lure your enemies into an ambush. Also, because the levels are flat as a pancake, tactics that rely on the use of the location's architecture or topography are completely off the table in this game. In Tower of Time there were like referential enemies wandering about, but you didn't fight them there and then. You clicked on them and you got warped to a battle location, JRPG style. And in theory, I find it much more immersive to walk straight into the location where the battles are supposed to take place and have visual contact with the enemies that I am going to fight, rather than be teleported to an ad hoc arena for one particular combat encounter. But I feel like those ad hoc arenas you had in Tower of Time were cooler than the locations in which combat takes place in Dark Envoy. Some of them had caves that you could retreat into and use as choke points, some had natural hazards and traps, and many of them had puzzly conditions that you had to figure out to undo some of the bad guys' advantages. And I feel like a lot of that is missing in Dark Envoy. The insane difficulty level is the only remotely challenging difficulty level in this game, and I do recommend that you play the game on insane. But sometimes it's going to happen that you're going to be dominating a combat encounter thoroughly for the first few minutes, and then the game's going to summon a type of enemy that has a talent that you didn't account for, and you're going to be ill-prepared to face it. That is to say, in a disadvantageous position within the battlefield, or without any mana left, or with all your skills on cooldown time, or all of these things at the same time, and it's going to be a wipe. Sure, you can do it again, and the second time around you're probably going to own it, but no one's going to refund the time you wasted on that first attempt, and believe me, you are going to feel like the game owes you the time you wasted on that first failed attempt. I think this design of lockdown areas and enemy spawn points is not the best for an RPG for a number of other reasons. In an ARPG, you want to advance and kill everything within sight to progress to your next objective ASAP. This system, however tactically challenging, hurts the pace of the game in my opinion. By the time I reached the final act of the game, I felt like it had already outstayed its welcome, and I blame the game's lockdown/spawn point design for this. On the other hand, in CRPGs, every combat encounter you beat inside a dungeon, for example, is a milestone. Like a piton in climbing, it's a victory over a part of the dungeon that you've claimed as your own. But this lockdown area/enemy spawn point design robs you of the possibility of going back to that part of the dungeon that you have already conquered to use it to your advantage, and I positively do not like that. Some bosses are fun and interesting in their design. The Empire Inquisitor boss is the highlight for me, because it pulled the rug from under my party and forced me to think of new tactics and actions. But most of them are your typical damage-soaking sponges with hundreds of thousands of health points that try to overwhelm you with ads and take forever to kill, and I found those to be incredibly tedious. Most of them weren't even all that hard, but they all exhausted my patience and made me want to take a break from the fight. They weren't even battles of attrition because your resources replenish over time. They were straight up boring! Difficulty in this game is wildly inconsistent, just as it was in Tower of Time. The tutorial level, depending on the loot you get early on, ends with a boss fight that is way harder than it needed to be. And I felt like this was because the game was trying to get every explanation out the door as soon as possible. But almost immediately after that fight, the game becomes almost laughably easy. In fact, I don't usually crank up the difficulty too hard in a game that I have not played before, but I had to in Dark Envoy because I was mindlessly tanking and spanking my way through loads upon loads of enemies, and I felt like that was a huge waste of the game's numerous tactical skills. And not much later I had to crank it up again to insane for the same reasons. And even on the insane difficulty, I was crushing enemies left and right for a good chunk of the game. That was until I reached a mad difficulty spike around the middle of the game. A spike that soon became a plateau rather than a spike, because it stayed on for quite a few areas. I didn't mind this though, in fact, this was when the game truly started to shine for me. But after I got a few upgrades in gear, and after acquiring a couple of new global tactical skills, the game became a non-challenge again, until I reached another difficulty spike that also became a plateau. Combat mechanics in Dark Envoy are pretty freaking neat, and I do think that other developers could learn a thing or two from Event Horizon's combat design. And I'm not even kidding you, I wish more real-time with pause games had combat mechanics like the ones in Dark Envoy. But the bland level layout, the dated lockdown and enemy spawn design of the combat encounters, the damage spongy bosses, and the wild shifts in difficulty cancel out almost everything that's good about the combat aspect of the game. By the last act of the game, I just wanted the damn thing to be over. And this isn't a great thing in a game that revolves mostly around combat. Exploration is non-existent in Dark Envoy. Tower of Time at least gave you the illusion of exploration. There were a few climbable places, a few shifting locations here and there, and the level design from an artistic point of view was much more interesting. But Dark Envoy consists of a collection of painfully generic flat surfaces completely devoid of secret rooms or interconnecting passageways. There is one secret location near the end of the game, and it's so exceptional that there's even a Steam achievement for it. Also, every mining node, chest, and research beacon are marked on your map, thus completely killing any feeling of discovery that you might have gotten from finding these things. Mission areas in Dark Envoy are littered with traps, and these are hands down the most pointless traps that I've ever seen in any game. First, skills like perception and trap disarming aren't a thing in this game. Traps are just lying about and they are highlighted on your screen. The only thing that you can do is avoid them, and you can't disarm them. You can shoot some of them, but most of them rearm. If you fall into any of these traps, you get a temporary status like bleeding, poison, or mind control. But this usually only lowers the affected party member's armor, and because armor replenishes over time, you'll be as good as new sooner rather than later every time you fall into one. Also, enemies don't seem to be affected by them, so why are there even traps in the game to begin with? As for puzzles, Dark Envoy has a few of those, but they are too few and too far in between. In Tower of Time, some puzzles were a little bit annoying because they required you to go back and forth between the various floors in the tower, but there were many more that were actually interesting. And there was some sense of accomplishment to them. And to be fair, this is also the case with 2 or 3 of the puzzles in Dark Envoy. One of them is even superbly integrated with the combat. This puzzle here, for example. Why aren't there more passages that combine combat with puzzles, Event Horizon? You guys are really good at this. Why don't you lean more on this type of sequences? But puzzles were evenly distributed throughout the game's many levels in Tower of Time. In Dark Envoy, there's one mission that's chock-a-block with puzzles, but there's just like 2 or 3 of them in the rest of the game. It's as though the developers had said at some point near the end of the game's development, "Holy shit, man, wasn't our game supposed to have puzzles? We totally forgot about that. Oh well, never mind, let's add a new mission and throw all of our puzzles ideas into it and be done with it." There's also questing in Dark Envoy, but the questing aspect of the game is almost a footnote. There's nothing much to it other than taking on the quest, going to the quest location marked on your map, and following the yellow brick road to completion, which is typically paved with combat encounters and nothing else. On occasions, you will get to make a Boolean choice at the end of the quest, And to be fair, these decisions have consequences later on in the game. I didn't give too much of a shit about any of them because I wasn't invested in this story, but there were consequences, if you must know. I didn't find any of the quests to be interesting in the slightest, and this is because most of them feel irrelevant to your character's mission. Some of them feel almost crowbarred into the game to justify the existence of the next mission area, which is there in turn to justify the game's running time. In Everspace 2, you don't get to make any decisions, but the story in that game follows a proper story structure all the way through. So quests are missions that you need to embark upon because Adam and his friends need to overcome obstacles and difficulties that come from story-related events.
Massive spoilers coming your way.
In Dark Envoy, on the other hand, quests feel a little bit like Sisyphus's punishment. It's like they are pushing the plot uphill almost against its will. There are 2 warring factions in the game that ask you to undertake missions for them, but the only motivation that you have to do these things is that they may have some relevant information on some obscure group who might have been responsible for your parents' death. Otherwise, for a large chunk of the game, this war feels like it has nothing to do with the main characters. So no, I didn't give 2 shits about any of the quests in this game. And worse yet, I felt like the quests got in the way of the combat, because there were too many story bits packed with dialogue sequences that were way longer than they needed to be. Tower of Time had fewer cutscenes and story moments, and yet I felt more immersed and interested in piecing together the mystery of the tower. A lot of what transpired story-wise in Tower of Time was relayed through party banter and little text snippets, and that made the action in the game flow a lot better. Overall, I think Dark Envoy's gameplay mix had a lot of potential, but I feel like the devs didn't always play to their strengths, and this resulted in an uneven experience that outstayed its welcome in most respects, story and lore. Think of the most awe-inspiring residential building that you've ever seen in your life, like something straight out of Zaha Hadid's catalog. And then imagine that you get invited to visit the inside of the building, and your hosts are the Peruvian folk singer known as La Tigresa del Oriente and Ecuadorian pop star El Delfín hasta el fin. And now imagine that these 2 give you a full tour of some of the ugliest and cheesiest apartments that you've ever seen in your life, packed full with puke-inducing furniture and decoration that you can only describe as eye cancer. Well, that's exactly how I would describe the story in Tower of Time. If you have not played this game, I think it's worth checking out, if only for the way in which they treat the mystery aspect of the game. Believe me when I tell you that this game features the most mind-blowing revelation that I've ever seen in a game. When the nature, origin, and purpose of the tower were revealed, I literally couldn't pick my jaw off from the floor. Not even going to say it was amazing, because that doesn't even begin to describe how awesome it was. But god damn it, the dialogue was cheesy and cringe like you wouldn't believe. Also, characters didn't feel at all like a product of their time. Their speech and mindsets weren't consistent in the slightest with who they were supposed to be. You had a couple of grown-ass adults that quarreled like only teenagers would. You had a mystical shadow creature who was hundreds of years old and was confrontational and childish, and a construct-like entity who played the role of the mustache-twirling villain. Most companions were painfully one-dimensional, and the game kept reminding us of the one personality trait they were supposed to have. And yet, that didn't stop their personalities from accommodating to what the plot needed from them. As for Dark Envoy, well, take that description I just gave you, and remove the mind-blowing revelation part, and you have the story in Dark Envoy. This time I am not even going to bother going over the plot, because it's an interesting stew of trite cliches like warring factions who've been manipulated by the real bad guys of the story, greedy evil merchant guilds who monopolize trade and lie to their people, and mysterious otherworldly beings who are behind everything. But just to give you an idea of just how bad the writing is, I'll tell you that the main characters arrive to a location where they expect to gather information about a certain tragic incident. They have no ties to the place or to the 2 factions who are at war, and they reluctantly agree to help these factions as hired mercenaries in the hopes that they will get some valuable information in return. But later in the game, one of them says this:
"They will still treat us like outsiders. No matter how many suicide missions we complete, I don't know if we can ever change that."
but not once was it even slightly hinted that they wanted to be anything other than outsiders. And this is not me cherry picking, this is just an example off the top of my head, for which I also happen to have footage. At some point something happens to Kayla, and she starts speaking in riddles and just knowing shit out of the blue, which is a cheap and plot convenient way to introduce missions. But that's not even the worst thing about it. When the other characters ask Kayla about why she's speaking in riddles and why all of a sudden she just happens to know where to go and what to do, she insists that she can't tell more and that she will explain later, but that she needs everyone to trust her. But when she reveals the reason behind all the secrecy, it's nonsense. She could have given that exact same explanation the first 100 times she was asked about it, and it would have had the exact same repercussions and costs. I do have to give credit to the writers for two things. Near the end of the game, they somehow managed to build up interesting stakes, and for once, I felt like my actions had a little bit of purpose. And second, at the end of the game, you get a final succession of stills, Fallout style, that tells you what became of your characters and makes the most out of the story decisions you made over the course of the game. It almost makes me want to endure the whole cringe parade once again, just to see how things would have turned out if I had taken different decisions. Almost.
Mind the spoilers coming your way.
The overarching premise that runs through both Tower of Time and Dark Envoy is not bad. And in the hands of better writers, it could have turned out spectacular. But I feel like the concept was a little too ambitious and the writers just didn't have the chops to pull it off. Overall, I think the story and lore aspects of the game aren't worth the price of the admission. Companions, lore-wise, I really didn't care about any of them. They are painfully one-dimensional and tropey. You have the typical disagreeable character who is confrontational because she's too badass to be hanging out with you, the goody two-shoes loyal paladin type who's there for you no matter what, your typical engineer who likes machines, and your textbook old wise lady who is always ready with a word of advice. The worst offender is probably the Legion-specific companion. She's immature and clingy, and I just can't buy into her being some sort of diplomatic representative. Also, the game doesn't even bother acknowledging which companions you bring with you for each mission. If a companion has a dialogue line in a conversation that takes place during a mission, he or she just appears out of nowhere, says his or her part, and then fucks off before the mission continues. And man, there are only 5 companions in the game. Was it too much to ask to have all of the actors record all of the lines? Or even give them lines of their own? Also, you don't get to talk to any of them outside story-related cutscenes, and you can only initiate conversations with them when they need to share their personal quests with you. So they're like a toxic ex-girlfriend who only calls you when she needs something. And dear developers, I think that when you have companions who tag along for the adventure in an RPG, especially if they have companion quests, you should be able to talk to them. This feature is a standard of the genre, and it feels like it's missing in Dark Envoy. Overall, to say that I was not impressed with my companions in Dark Envoy would be a monumental understatement. Companions gameplay-wise. This is probably one of the best things about Dark Envoy. Every companion has a different class, and every class has its uses in this game. Each class has a role to play, and they are all vital. By the end of every mission, I truly felt like I couldn't have done it without my companions. The MVP of the party changed from one combat encounter to the next depending on whose contribution was more critical to the success of the party, and this made me feel like everyone was equally valuable. But your party's biggest strength lies in your companions' cross-class synergies, and your best bet is to make the most out of that. In this respect, Dark Envoy pretty much blows every other game in the ballpark out of the water. Having Leon summon a mobile cover, then having Kayla use her wind stance ability, which greatly increases her damage, and then using her phantom roll skill to roll behind Leon's cover to benefit from the cover's healing over time effect, and the critical chance bonus from her passive skill Steady Hand, then activating her singular focus skill which grants additional damage and range bonuses, and then switching over to Vaso to trigger her fire damage skill, which adds fire damage, burn damage, and the shaken condition to all attacks to add further destructive power to Kayla's every attack. This is one of the lengthiest and most satisfying cross-class combos I've ever experienced in a game. I can't begin to describe the feeling of satisfaction that I got every time I saw my enemy's health bar going down 4 times faster with this badass combo than with regular attacks. It made me feel like a tactical mastermind. This aspect of the game is where Dark Envoy truly shines, and I wish some other developers took note of how party member synergies work in this game. Secondary mechanics and user experience. I already talked extensively about crafting, enchanting, and research. I'll just add that all of these disciplines are crucial to your character's progression and that they are the means by which you implement your own strategic vision. I also think these mechanics are robust and intuitive, and if I'm honest with you, sometimes I was more excited about engaging in these secondary mechanics than I was about the core aspect of the game. You also have trading and inventory management in Dark Envoy. Inventory management is pretty seamless and practical. You have tabs and sorting criteria, and more importantly, you have a common inventory for all party members, and I think more games should embrace this system. Trading is not as simple and as practical though. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. A crucial feature that every RPG has to have these days is to be able to compare every piece of gear in your inventory to each party member's equipped gear while you are trading. Developers everywhere, just look at Pillars of Eternity 2 and copy that shit to the T. Is it too much to ask? Needless to say, this is not something you can do in Dark Envoy. Except the faction-specific quartermaster that you unlock near the last third of the game, the vast majority of the time, vendors have absolutely nothing interesting to sell. Only the relic guy sells anything useful, and that's because relics aren't a part of the game's loot. I would have preferred that relics were loot instead of items available for purchase, but that's just a personal preference. The user experience isn't great in Dark Envoy, but most of the issues have to do with the game's subpar performance. The game is missing a couple of scroll functions here and there. They have been fixing many of these with patches, but there are still a few scroll bars missing. Also, in the enchanting screen, you can't quite tell who's equipping what. All these little icons look the same to me. It would have helped to see their names or a bigger portrait when hovering our cursor over the items. At the beginning of the game, I tried remapping my keybinds, but the game kept scrambling my configuration, and I even had to ditch out my first playthrough and start over from scratch, because after changing my keybinds, my character couldn't even move. Using my ranger's phantom roll under some circumstances triggered a glitch that rendered my character unusable. This was particularly infuriating because I lost at least 2 combat encounters because of this. Some areas you should definitely be able to walk over have invisible walls. The worst example of this was the area in which the final fight takes place, no less. You can pass through this space on the left flank, but not through the exact same place on the right flank, at least not consistently. Seriously guys, you have to fix this ASAP. I'm sure many of these issues are going to get fixed at some point, but I don't think the game should have been released with these many UX issues to begin with. Overall, this category is a bit of a mixed bag. Secondary mechanics are mostly good, but there are some fairly big user experience issues. Sound effects and mix. This time I am not going to play some sound snippets like I usually do before sharing my impressions, because this is hell of a mixed bag and I think it's worth breaking down. So let's start with combat. If you slow down combat instead of pausing it, you'll notice that the whole Sonic landscape goes into slow motion. And I don't think that what we hear when this happens is just slowed down sounds. I think there's additional post-production at work here, because the whole thing sounds like a Sonic Matrix, and I think that is pretty badass. Now that being said, sound effects for skills, spells, and even guns are just way too low in the mix, and I couldn't find a way to get them to sound right just by fiddling about with the sound options. And then I found out that this was partly because many of the sounds are just missing. Here you have Kayla badassedly dual wielding a couple of badass guns, one of which has a badass multi-shot enchantment. And as you can hear, there's nothing badass about the sound here. Also, sometimes the sound effects are a little bit out of sync with the animations, and the mixing combat situations that get too busy can become awfully muddy.
Sure, why not?
On.
Yes?
Let's get it done.
I think the sonic landscape in locations such as cities, dungeons, and most other areas in which the game takes place is a little bit thin. Places like labs and mines should be a lot busier sonically, but they sound rather empty. Cutscenes are probably the worst offender. Almost all of them feel like they are taking place in empty spaces where there's nothing going on. Here, for example, there's people working their asses off in the mine. And not only does the conversation that takes place not have any of the reverberation that you would expect from a cave location, but you also don't hear any sound whatsoever. Even if you can see people striking rocks with their picks. The UI has some pretty cool sounds here and there, but some others are noticeably absent. The sound mix is not great. Voices in particular feel like a thick sonic layer that's been dropped on top of everything else.
Someone manipulated natural mana reserves to summon those elementals.
It's like listening to a podcast while you play, you know, like the sound is coming from somewhere else other than the game itself. Also, cave locations don't sound cavey, desert locations don't sound deserty, and both cities are supposed to be open spaces that are high up in the clouds, and they don't sound anything like that. Overall, I found the game lacking in this department. Voice acting.
When I was in the military, I never enjoyed giving orders. I've issued way too many wrong ones, but I find solace in following yours.
Just to wait and see. Find something to keep ourselves occupied in the meantime.
That's right! Come on, I've had enough sitting around. Let's dig into something. Anything.
I don't know. Maybe Ben's right. We should probably kick back for a while, get our bearings. What do you think, Kayla? Kayla? Is everything alright?
There's one more thing we need to do.
Is it about the Oracle?
Yes, she's growing more anxious. Some things are about to be set in motion, and we need her to be reassembled before...
Before what?
All that matters is that we have to hurry.
Except for your companion Benedict, voice acting and voice direction are mostly decent. But the lines the characters have been given are shit, so it's really hard to focus on their delivery. The two protagonists are the best of the lot by far, with Malachi being the standout in my opinion. But you have characters like Leon with his forced, over-the-top accent, and Benedict who sounds like he's in the middle of swallowing a potato whenever it's his turn to speak. And his voice acting sucks, by the way. Overall, it's not terrible, but definitely not great either. Music. This is my favorite soundtrack of the year, bar none. I would almost say it's too good for its game. I kid you not. Sometimes I even felt like the game was getting in the way of me enjoying the soundtrack, which is something that hadn't happened since, I don't know, Tower of Time? Oh, wait. David Wajewski is the guy you want to look at. I'll leave a link to the game's soundtrack page and Spotify in the description section. I think that both Dark Envoy and Tower of Time were built upon a solid concept story-wise. What I mean is that there is an amazing story hidden somewhere inside these games, but it just isn't the story the games tell. But Dark Envoy's soundtrack succeeds at everything the writing in the game fails to convey. The feeling of grief, for example, that comes in the wake of losing someone important, a feeling that we can all understand and relate to, comes through subtly but unequivocally in the track that plays moments after the tragic incident that marks the beginning of our protagonist's journey. You can feel Malachi's and Kayla's mourning present in the track more than in any of their dialogue lines or the narration that we get at the end of the act. Themes like the conflict between the chaotic forces of nature and magic on one hand and the human desire to bring order through technology and science on the other, a theme that is clumsily embedded in the game's narrative, is seamlessly woven into music pieces that feature flowy melodies with the occasional flute and clarinet arrangements battling for supremacy against digital-sounding synthy sequences. Dark Mountains, for example, is an oddly pessimistic tune with killer clarinet moments that sounds almost Kafkian, like the game is trying to paint the bleak picture of an inevitable dark future conjured up by forces larger than life. It's a mostly classical sounding piece, but very low in the mix. Almost like a hidden undertone, there's this occasional robot-y, machine-y pattern that sounds like the game is hinting at the true nature of the bad guys, and maybe even foreshadowing a certain prequel. See, a good soundtrack nails the tone and vibe of its game. It's adequately medieval, or post-apocalyptic, or space sci-fi, depending on the theme of the game. But a great soundtrack also nails the dramatic intention of every passage of the game, the internal struggles of their characters, and the primal motivations that set them on a collision course against each other. And the soundtrack in Dark Envoy gets all of this right, even if its own story doesn't. This is a masterpiece of a soundtrack, but I'm afraid that just 2 isolated tracks aren't going to be enough for you to get a full grasp of just how much of a strong artistic personality this soundtrack has. So that's why I strongly encourage you to check out all of it by clicking the link of its Spotify page that you'll find in the description section down below. If I could give it a 20 out of 10, I would. Graphics. I think this is a significant step down from Tower of Time. Maybe not technically, but from an artistic point of view, definitely. Tower of Time was more out there, it was immersive to the point of being enrapturing, and it really made the most out of its only scenario, which, when you think of it, was nothing but the inside of a tower. But fuck me, talk about world within world. Dark Envoy feels a little bit tame and safe in comparison. Illustrations are the standout aspect of the graphic package in my opinion. They have all the artistic personality that their 3D counterparts lack. The game's locations have been competently rendered, I guess. They look detailed and believable enough, but many of them feel uninspired. My main problem is that only a handful of them feel lived in. In this location, for example, you can see dried bloodstains on the floor, a ladder that's just lying there in disarray, and several books and items that are just piled up haphazardly here and there. It feels like a location that people had to flee from all of a sudden. The old Empire capital is the standout location of the game by far, and is also proof that an inspired location makes a world of difference in a video game. This place is also where the most exciting and intriguing part of the game takes place, and I think that it is precisely because the location looks and feels dangerous and mysterious. But most other locations feel like they were erected the day before. There aren't any oil-stained cloths lying about where there are engineers working, there are no haphazardly piled up tents down where a horde-like group of mercenaries live, there are no broken or misplaced tiles in plaza floors, and mission areas like swamps, forests, and deserts feel repetitive, sameish, and bland. The UI aspect of the game is very pretty, but the problem is that in Tower of Time it was gorgeous, so it still feels like a step down. Character models are okay, serviceable if a little bit inexpressive, but because the game relies a little too much on cutscenes, they start to get a little hard on the eye at some point. Enemies are significantly cooler than your companions and NPCs, and they are as visually varied as the talents they command. Graphics aren't great in Dark Envoy, but I think they are at least serviceable. Performance and stability, it's bad. There's no way to candy code it, loading screens take forever, there are frequent noticeable FPS drops that slow the game to a crawl, and if I notice this, it's because it's really bad, because I usually don't notice FPS drops even when they are pretty big, and when I do, I tend to be very forgiving about it. But this game has some serious issues in this department. The game also froze completely 4 times, and one of those times was so bad that I even had to restart my computer. Also, at some point the camera just went wild and panned out of the action, and it took me several minutes to figure out how to center it again. That's in part because I'm dumb and I just needed to select a character, but that's neither here nor there. I usually don't recommend to wait for a game to be fully patched before you get it, but in this case, if you are still curious about this title and want to give it a shot, I'd say it'll be best for you to wait for a bit until all its performance issues get sorted out. Other considerations and final thoughts. I want Event Horizon to succeed, I truly do. Of all the devs who've sent me assets, press kits, and dossiers for me to use on the videos I make about their games, these guys have been by far the most pro of the lot, hands down. From the quality of the assets they sent to the naming conventions they use, it's all been super tight. They also clearly care about their games and their customers. If the fact that they released a 14GB patch to address all the issues recorded by the community is not evidence enough of their commitment to their games, then nothing is. And I think that they have a gem in their hands with their combat system, a gem that has not been discovered yet by the RPG crowd. And it's a pity, because I think a good chunk of the people who live in our little RPG corner would love it. I also think that if you peel away the layers of cheesy writing, generic characters, and plot-convenient bullshit, you have a diamond in the rough with the overarching premise of the universe that Event Horizon has cooked up for Tower of Time and Dark Envoy. But there are a couple of things that hold these games back and keep them from being all the talk, even within our enthusiastic little corner of the video game world. The first one is that their formula has problems. It's not like From Software's formula that has been tweaked and perfected over the course of the years with games like Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring, but that was nonetheless from the very get-go back in the days of the original Demon Souls, a formula that filled in a gap in the gaming market, and it filled it thoroughly. Or John Romero's FPS concept that was so tight back in the day and aged so well that it has seen a resurgence in recent years with all the many boomer shooters that have been coming out. Event Horizon's concept clearly seeks to appeal to ARPG and CRPG fans alike by blending in core concepts from both of these subgenres, but it fails to tick some of the boxes of the most important pain points of their respective crowds. The ARPG crowds are the Solarians of the lot.
The Solarians like their wars won before they start.
These people expect their builds to do the heavy lifting. For them, strategy and tactics take place on these screens, rather than on these screens. These screens are supposed to be a dopamine-infused click-click-click fest. In-game complex multi-character tactical decisions, lockdown areas, enemy spawn points, dense narratives, and truckloads of cutscenes are concepts that aren't going to fly with this crowd, I tell you. The CRPG crowd, on the other hand, want to be in the driver's seat of the experience. They like their choice and consequence. They like to build smart-mouthed, silver-tongued charlatan characters or brutish juggernauts of destruction, and they expect the game to acknowledge these choices and provide suitable outcomes. They want to explore their companions' motivations and backgrounds. They want to win them over to their cause, or tell them to fuck off or even kill them if they become too disagreeable. Giving the players zero input on their characters' personalities and story-relevant skills like persuasion or intimidation, giving them zero chance to talk with their companions outside of combat missions, and substituting all of that with occasional binary choices at the end of some of the missions isn't going to cut it. The second problem that I see is that these guys seem to refuse to play to their strengths. There are brilliant passages in this game, namely those that combine puzzle solving and combat. And hey, having a killer combat system and just the perfect enemy design to go with it, that's not a small thing. You can build an entire game around that. And it's not like those are the only things that these guys have. There's brilliant music, fantastic illustrations, and many other cool things to work with. But unfortunately, they insist on giving us story-driven RPGs when they just don't have the writing chops for it. Yes, you have a very good idea with lots of potential, but until you have the right people to shape this idea into an engaging story, I think it should be changed for a simpler and more straightforward concept. But hey, aiming high is something that I can definitely get behind, even if you don't quite get there at first. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. Share the video if you thought it was cool, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.